Okay, so welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I'm talking about some of my favorite fashion journalists. Not every single one of my favorite fashion journalists will make this video. So if you want me to do a part 2 or a part 3, let me know who I've left out of this video and we'll get those done. So the first fashion journalist I'm going to talk about is Robin Givhan. Robin Givhan, in my opinion, is probably the most elite fashion writer in fashion right now, like hands down. She won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2006, which was actually the first time a fashion writer was ever given the award. She's also written a book on the Battle of Versailles, which at this point is really a fashion bible. People always refer to it when they talk about how American fashion conquered Paris at the height of Parisian haute couture. So yeah, Robin Givhan is just amazing. Currently, she's the senior critic at large at the Washington Post. And her articles are so interesting because she writes about basically the intersection between fashion, culture, politics, and art, which is not a perspective you get from really anyone else as good as she writes. So that's why I really love her stuff. I always read her articles. I actually have my Google Chrome set up that every time, you know that option on startup, every time I start up my laptop and I start up Google Chrome, I get all the new articles from all my favorite journalists. So that's how I'm able to read every single article that they basically publish. And that's how I stay on top of it, essentially. But yeah, that's Robin Givhan. 100% I would recommend to check out her work. Next, I'm talking about Cathy Horyn. Now, Cathy Horyn is the fashion critic at large at The Cut. She used to be a fashion critic at the New York Times, I believe from 1999 to 2014. Now, what I really love about Cathy Horyn is whether I agree with her opinion or not, she's always going to speak her mind and she's always going to say it in a genuine way. And like I always say, it's important as a critic to actually have knowledge, to actually know things. So when you read Cathy Horyn's criticisms, even if you don't agree, it's not coming from a place of that's trash, or like stuff that you see on Twitter, like that dress is garbage without any context. And if you ask these people, okay, why is it garbage, then they won't be able to tell you. But Cathy Horyn is very knowledgeable about fashion. She knows her fashion history. She knows what she's talking about. Really knowledgeable. So it's coming from a very educated standpoint when she critiques things, as opposed to like a lot of the critiques you see. And that's why I love Cathy Horyn, because even if I don't agree or I agree, there's always something to learn from her critiques. And that's why I've always loved Cathy Horyn. And to be honest, I'm always going to commend someone that speaks their mind in fashion, because now that I work in the fashion industry, it just shocks me how few people are willing to say their mind about collections or designers, because a lot of you might not know, but fashion is extremely corrupt. Journalists take money under the table all the time from brands and from different people. So a lot of journalists, they can't even say anything because they're literally taking money under the table to keep giving good reviews to certain brands. So they can't possibly say negative things because then they're going to lose loads of money that they're used to getting essentially from a lot of these brands and some designers and stuff. And also, they will forego getting their free gifts from these designers. They will forego getting the dinners and getting the invites to these amazing shows. So there's a lot of incentive for journalists just not to say anything. They benefit a lot from just not being critical about anything and just praising everything blindly.
But however different the publications may be, according to Michael Gross of New York Magazine, there are but two types of fashion journalists: reporters and cheerleaders.
Cheerleaders tend not to write nasty things. Cheerleaders tend, in many cases, not to write the truth. My first season in Paris, I had to go backstage at a show where I hated the collection. And I walked backstage and bang, face to face with Martine Zitmon. And out of my mouth came one of the worst things that you could possibly say when she asked me what I thought of the collection. I said it was interesting. Oh, God, forgive me for that. And her face fell, and I knew I had made a mistake. So I went to one of the great old dragon ladies of the fashion press, whose name I won't tell you, and I said, what do you do in a case like that? And she said, there is always something to like, even if it's a shoe. And this is what many fashion writers do, is they look for that shoe because they're not going to criticize that dear designer who invites them to dinner, places them at their right at dinner, gives them clothes at wholesale, at cost, at discount, for free, sucks up to them backstage, makes them feel important.
It's a very press-conscious profession, as you very well know. And there's a lot of money invested in lobbying the press of all kinds, magazines, newspapers, television.
I mean, realize these are reporters working on reporters' salaries, dealing with egomaniacal millionaires. And so pleasing these egomaniacal millionaires becomes very, very, very important to them. I don't care whether I eat dinner with these people.
There are people around designers, some of whom are smart and some of whom aren't smart. And every journalist has been threatened in one time or another by someone who says, I'm going to cancel my advertising if you don't do this.
I mean, there is a lot of bribery that goes on. I see the carrier bags arriving at my hotel in Paris, not addressed to me, addressed to everybody else, you know, and I sort of peep into them and think, oh, that looks like a nice jacket. But that's, you know, they've bought that space, basically, if they're going to give them a free coat.
And that's why I respect Cathy Horyn. I respect someone else who I wasn't going to talk about in this video, but Eugene Rabkin from Zeitgeist is also someone I really respect because he has a very educated opinion and he's very opinionated with his critiques. So I always appreciate that. Something interesting that did actually happen this year was in Balenciaga's latest spring-summer show when Cathy Horyn actually walked on the runway. I thought that was very interesting because to me it almost felt like Cathy Horyn is a very polarizing figure in fashion. She's someone that speaks her mind, and that's why a lot of designers are, let's say, scared of her. There are people like Adi Slimane that just don't like Cathy Horyn at all. And I'll actually put on the screen what Adi Slimane said about Cathy Horyn. It's absolutely hilarious how sensitive he got because of a bad critique. But it's just funny that Demna Gvasalia is almost like having this commentary of having a fashion critic who is very polarizing and is banned from shows, having that person walk in a Balenciaga runway show, which is one of the biggest brands in fashion right now. The juxtaposition I thought was really, really intelligent. I really liked that, seeing that. That was really, really interesting. So yeah, that was just like one of the recent interesting moments around Cathy Horyn that I thought about to mention. And also, like everyone mentioned in this list, Cathy Horyn has also published many fashion books. I can't even begin to start naming all of them. The next fashion journalist I'm going to talk about is Alexander Fury. So Alexander Fury is the features editor of another magazine and the men's critic of the Financial Times newspaper. He also has so many published books, and on his website he has actually curated a few books that he wants people to know that he's written. So I'll put those on the screen for all of you to read. Now, what I specifically love about Alexander Fury, not saying because everyone on this list is super knowledgeable about fashion. This is why I follow their work. But Alexander Fury is literally like a fashion brain box, like Wikipedia encyclopedia type person. He always, sometimes when I read his articles or I watch an interview with Alexander Fury in it, he always says some stuff that I'm like, what the fuck is that? I'll be watching an interview by Alexander Fury, and then he just starts talking about some random stylist in the 80s that was really influential that I'd never heard about. And in my head, I'm just thinking, who's that? And I'm doing research, and then I find this whole new world. And that is really what you get with Alexander Fury, is these crazy nuggets of information that help you to tie things together, even down to sometimes on Instagram, he might recommend books that I might be like, oh, that's interesting. I've not heard of that story. I haven't read that, or I need to read about that again. So he's just a really interesting person and someone whose knowledge really translates in terms of someone like me who's really just trying to learn more about fashion. Alexander Fury is always a good resource in terms of seeking that information, if that makes sense. His knowledge doesn't also just come from maybe experience working in the industry or, reading books and all that stuff, which he does. But he's also well known for having a very extensive fashion collection of vintage clothes that I one day want to see in person, hopefully. So it's just amazing. He's just an amazing character. And as a writer, just a really good writer. So definitely check out Alexander Fury's work. So many books I can't even begin to mention. I actually own quite a few of the books he's written or worked on, because not every single book he's worked on, he's the only author. Sometimes he's been a co-author on certain books. But yeah, I own quite a few books that he's worked on. Next, I'm going to talk about Tim Blanks, probably the most popular journalist on this list. But if you don't know, Tim Blanks is currently the editor-at-large at The Business of Fashion. He has written loads of books, like everyone else I've mentioned. I own a lot of the books he's worked on as well. Now, before I even talk about Tim Blanks' work, I will say that Tim Blanks is one of the nicest people in fashion I've met, which is, I know it's crazy to say, but not many people in fashion are nice, especially people that are as established in the fashion industry as Tim Blanks. I don't know if that's a thing of all the people that work at The Business of Fashion, because I've said this about like Imran Ahmed is really down to earth. Tim Blanks is really down to earth. Just really nice people. I don't know, I just have great experiences with them. I've actually interviewed Tim Blanks when he wrote his Versace Catwalk book. I worked with Thames and Hudson during the press run, so I actually got to interview him about the history of Versace and kind of what he was thinking when he wrote the book, the questions he had, all that sort of stuff. I would say it's a really interesting podcast to listen to. So I'll put it on the screen, but if you type any podcast medium, you just type in Versace Tim Blanks, it'll probably come up. And since then, I see him around and he's like really nice, really accommodating, really down to earth. I'm telling you, in fashion, there are people who have not even achieved a quarter of what Tim Blanks has done, but yet their ego is so big that you couldn't even fit their ego in London. It's like insane. But like most people that are kind of young that got into fashion not that long ago, I found out about Tim Blanks when he was at style.com. For guys that don't know what style.com is, it was kind of like this platform, kind of like a TV sort of thing, where Tim Blanks would go, and not just Tim Blanks, but he was like the main presenter. He would go to like all the runway shows and talk about the fashion shows and interview like different journalists that were at the shows about their thoughts on the collection, different celebrities, different stylists. It was really, really interesting. I think the closest thing we have to that right now is what Loic Prigent does, because Loic Prigent is friends with a lot of designers and brands, so he has the access. But I think the big difference, which is why I still feel like the style.com hole that Tim Blanks left when style.com just ended hasn't been filled completely, is because Loic Prigent, what he does is really, really important. He has access to designers, so he can interview designers directly about what their inspiration was for the collection. We can see a lot of the clothes up close. We get the design details. The designers are talking about their collections extensively. But not really an issue, but one thing I think is missing in Loic Prigent's videos is any sort of like critique about anything. So then it just tends that Loic Prigent's videos tend to just be too much praise. Like everyone's like, oh my God, it's amazing. Everyone Loic Prigent interviews is like, oh my God, it's amazing. You feel like you're not really learning anything other than what the designer has said. There's no like critical thought to balance your ideas. And I think that's what style.com really did well, where Tim Blanks would interview journalists that had opposing opinions. And once again, these are people that have educated opinions. They're not just spouting things out of nowhere. And I think that critique, because back then that made me learn about fashion quicker, because I can take two different opinions and now I have to do my research to see what side I agree with. But when you're just watching something where everything's just praised, oh my God, everyone's like, oh my God, it's amazing. It's like this utopia of just like amazing clothes. And I feel like the lack of critique in fashion and the amount of voices or people that are so scared to say anything about fashion, negative, or not even necessarily negative, but just critical. This is why brands get away with selling cotton t-shirts for $700, or they're sending $1,000 cotton hoodies, plain cotton hoodies on the runway, like what Gucci did basically. But yeah, I hope soon someone does kind of like the style.com thing. I think that would be really interesting, and I think that's one thing we're definitely missing in fashion. But since then, since the style.com days, I obviously followed a lot of Tim Blanks' work, and I found out about like a lot of other things he's written, maybe for like Fantastic Man or GQ. But he's so good with words. He's an absolute wordsmith. And I really like the way that he says certain things. He like has really interesting references. Like he might have watched some like film from the 90s. And then when he's describing like a dress, he'll be like, this dress is like the ocean and the sea from the da-da-da-da movie in the 90s and the da-da-da-da. He's such a wordsmith, and he has a very poetic way of speaking, and he does write that way. I do think that he does fall into some hurdles writing that way, if I was to be like really constructive, because I've seen him do that thing where he's being really poetic and then say things that in my mind, like I remember one time he was writing about like Phoebe Philo, and he was doing that thing where she's the this and the that and the that and the this. And I think he said something along the lines of she invented like ghetto chic. And I really don't know what he was alluding to. Until now, I'm trying to understand that. But I just can't see any world in which Phoebe Philo invented a ghetto chic aesthetic. But that's what happens sometimes when you're that poetic. You might end up saying things like that. So in those instances, I obviously don't agree with what he's saying, but for the most part, he's an amazing journalist, super knowledgeable, written so many books, an extensive understanding of fashion. I remember when I interviewed him about the Versace book, and he was saying that he's been to like almost all of Donatella's Versace shows, or I think even all of them, if I remember clearly, which is insane. Like completely insane. So he's been covering fashion for so long. He just has an endless wealth of knowledge. So definitely someone to check out. I always read what he writes on BOF, and I always look forward to when he writes, especially during like the runway season, because that's when he's normally doing a lot of the writing. And then he also has a good podcast with Imran Ahmed. So at the end of every Fashion Week cycle, Imran Ahmed and Tim Blanks, if you didn't know, they sit down and then they talk about and just reflect about all the different shows that happen during Fashion Week on the BOF podcast. So definitely check that out if you aren't aware. The next fashion journalist I'm talking about is Rachel Tashjian. Now, Rachel Tashjian is a fashion writer for the Washington Post. I actually found out about her when she was a writer at GQ. And honestly, this is why Rachel was like such a good writer. I never really cared for anything that was written at GQ. The only reason why I ever read a GQ article was because of who was writing it, not necessarily because it's like GQ. So when Tim Blanks would write stuff at GQ, I would read it because it's Tim Blanks. And I think Rachel was also another example of someone that I consistently was going to GQ just to see what she had written. And she had so many interesting articles that were big on social media. And I like her writing style. She has a really witty and sometimes humorous way of like tone of voice when she writes. And it's really interesting because it's so hard to do. That I remember, this just reminds me of when I was studying fashion journalism at Central St. Martin's, and how when you try to write in a funny way, some of my lecturers would be like, you can write in a humorous way, but it has to make sense, Aya. And it just reminds me of that, because so many writers, I read their articles and they're trying to be funny, but the jokes are just so dry and they fall so flat. And that never really seems to be the case with Rachel. She just has that right balance of being humorous and witty and also being like really serious. And it's a very different writing style to what you get from a lot of other fashion journalists. And since then, because I've just been a fan of her writing, I've basically followed everywhere she's gone to. So when she went to Harper's Bazaar, I was reading her articles at Harper's Bazaar. Now she's at the Washington Post. I'm reading her articles at the Washington Post. But yeah, she's just so amazing. And she also does some really other interesting things. Like she has a newsletter called Opulent Tips. And I remember during lockdown, people were like begging to be a part of this like private newsletter. And it was hilarious. Like people were literally writing whole essays on Twitter trying to explain why they deserve to be added to the Opulent Tips list. It's just so funny. But it's interesting that she has such a cult following of people that just kind of like want to be recommended things by her. And I do think she's interesting because normally at, you know, magazines like GQ, like Vogue, all these kind of fashion magazines, they normally have these columns where they're like, oh, what our fashion editors are wearing this week, what our fashion editors... And those articles are most of the time are big snooze fests because I don't know why, but a lot of fashion journalists dress in a very boring way. There are very few fashion journalists that have like interesting personal style. which there's nothing wrong with dressing boring. It just doesn't make for an interesting article when they're showing clothes that you just see everywhere all the time, constantly. And because Rachel Tashjian has really interesting personal style, I remember at GQ when they would do those articles like, oh, what Rachel has bought at Etsy or what she's shopping at at Etsy or whatever. They were always really interesting because she's always buying things and wearing things that are really out of the ordinary. So that's something that I also find really interesting about her as a person. And that's why I really like what she has to say, especially about style, because I just think her style is so interesting. So I'm also really interested on what she has to say about style in general and where style was going and things like that. Now, the last fashion journalist I'm talking about in this video is Vanessa Friedman. Now, Vanessa Friedman is the fashion director and chief fashion critic of the New York Times. And she definitely has more of like a serious tone of voice when she writes. But once again, someone that's really knowledgeable, written very many books, worked on many books. She has been writing for a very, very long time, like forever, like since before I was born, which is crazy to like think about. She's been working in the industry since before I was born. But yeah, just super knowledgeable. I really enjoy reading her articles. And this is something I say all the time, but because Vanessa Friedman is so established in her industry and she has the access to designers, so you're always going to learn reading articles from someone that has been covering fashion for so long. They have anecdotes of things from like before I was born. She has like direct access to interview designers directly, interview CEOs directly about topics. So they make for very, very, very educational things to read. I also really like reading her column in the New York Times. It's called Ask Vanessa, and it's literally just people asking her questions and her answering and her giving like people tips. It literally reminds me of Diana Vreeland's sort of column where she would kind of give suggestions on what like people should wear and things like that. It's really interesting. So yeah, Vanessa Friedman, also a very, very good person to check out and follow her writing and read her articles. But yeah, that's part one done. Let me know if I left anyone out. There are obviously so many people that I could mention, like Eugene Rabkin, Suzy Menkes, but I just thought I don't want to make this video too long, so I'll just keep it short. And while I don't agree with every single opinion that every single journalist has in this list, I really, really, really love their work. I read their writing. I think they're all exceptional writers. And like, I'm always looking forward to the next thing that they release, the next thing they publish, the next book they work on. I'm always following it because I think these people especially just have really, really good, educated opinions, essentially. So there's always something to learn from these people, if that makes sense. But yeah, on that note, I'll be back with another video very soon. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.